I'm gonna show you how I made some of the sounds in this project, which is the project from the 10-minute challenge video. So I'm gonna go ahead and play the track in its current state. First, I'm gonna talk a little bit about this Harmer bass here. I used the main volume envelope for the kind of as an LFO to make it sound like it's wobbling. You can kind of pull that off by doing this and just pulling on these dots and messing around with it in context of the track until it just about sounds right to your ear. And I've put up this number to 2, which makes it go from a saw to a square. And I've also engaged all the unison voices and panned it out quite a bit, about halfway. Adjusted the phase down to about halfway. This all controls the unison, and then I have the pitch down to the bottom so it's not as spread out and not as washed out. And then I've used the phaser with the Hertz mode over here on the deeper setting, but either one of them sounds good. I like the combination of the Hertz and the deeper because it makes it sound kind of metallic with the width position here, and I've modulated it by right-clicking it and going into this window. And it's a cool little trick I learned from Virtual Riot. Pretty cool. The effects chain isn't anything too crazy really, just a bit of EQing and then a vocoder. In this vocoder, I've turned up the wet to have the full effect of the vocoder, and also turned up the internal sound gradizer right over here. And I've messed with the release a bit. I unchecked this min times knob over here, this button, and messed with the release, which makes it sound much tighter if you crank it down, as release would. And I've messed with the bandwidth over here, this bandwidth knob, and I've also altered the bandwidth gain multiplier over here to the shape of the sound, and I've done the same with the bandwidth window. So you just click and drag to change that. So I've pretty much just messed with it until it sounded the way I wanted it to, and until it emphasized the sound that I want to. And you can also do subtractive kind of sound design by taking away from it, which I'll show you an example of that in just a little bit with one of the growl type of sounds. So you can see all these little changes definitely affect the way Vocodex responds, and you can do the same thing with the modular pitch shift window, which will change the pitch of the Vocodex effect across the spectrum. And then I've EQ'd it again just a bit, taking out some of the highs, just EQing in different areas, and then OTT to compress it and control and even it out a bit. So I've just taken the depth down, time down a little bit, and turned the gain down a bit, and then a bit of reverb over here at the end for the modulation. It only plays at this part, it kind of swells in at the end to make it sound big and spacey. And that's it for the effects chain for this sound. So I'm using a Spectral Monster 7 wavetable by Seamless, and I've modulated the wavetable position and the level with the first LFO, and as well as the pitch up here. So the pitch does move according to the LFO 1. Now my second LFO is 1/2, and it's controlling the bend minus position, just to mix up the sound a little bit. add some variation to it, so it's not all just moving together. Then I have the high pass 12 filter modulating the cutoff and the mix. So the cutoff, well, the filter itself is a high pass filter with a band reject, and the cutoff just moves the high pass filter position, and then the mix mixes in the filter, and that kind of makes it sound more interesting in my opinion. So it mixes in the filter and it doesn't play it throughout the entire sound, and busting out into a growl solo here apparently. But I've also got this noise oscillator, which is just mixing in the noise a bit. So I've modulated the level with this first LFO I mean. So here's without the oscillator playing, you can hear the white noise a lot more, but when the oscillator is playing, it mixes in nicely and thickens out the sound and sounds really good with Vocodex. So here I have some distortion. I have selected post, and this is just the classic tube, and I've messed around with this until it sounds good. That's pretty much the reasoning behind this. Cranked up the drive almost all the way, around 90%, 85%ish, and mix up all the way. Then a phaser with the rate all the way down, and screw around with the depth and the frequency a bit, and messing around with those can give you some pretty cool results. Next up, I'm using this EQ, so I've got a peak and a dip, a notch, and I'm modulating both frequencies, and that creates kind of this MacGyvered vowel filter. So it sounds pretty cool. Just gotta tweak the spots where these two positions meet, and you'll get a nice cool vowel sound. And since I've messed around with these settings so much, the sound is a lot different than it was originally, so I don't think I'm gonna get it to sound the same right now, but either way it still sounds cool. So to start off, again, I have some EQing before my saturation and vocoding, because that affects the way those effects sound and respond. And of course Saturn is a saturator, but you can use Blood Overdrive as well. As a matter of fact, I think it sounds a little bit better in my opinion. I don't know why I didn't use this the first time, but it sounds pretty good. So then I vocoded it, and I did the same thing with the wet and the sound gradizer and this release time here. So I've turned both of these up, and the release time I've just kind of kept up a little bit. And I've cranked this up as well, the bandwidth, and I've turned down the pitch modulator. And I've taken these things down to just 1 dot, whatever that means. And this I've pretty much left the same, but it can be cool to mess around with the number of bands. It can definitely make a big difference in how it sounds, but the more bands you use, the more CPU it uses up, I believe, because it will create more bands to affect, and for you to affect in these windows, which is pretty cool. So if you have more bands, you can do more precise editing in these video windows, but you can really get creative when you draw out these envelopes here, and the way it affects the sound is very drastic and can definitely be used for some cool sound design. And then I've messed around with the bandwidth, and I've just pretty much drew in this little dip here, but again, can be pretty creative with it. And same with the modulator pitch shift, that affects the pitch shift modulator there. So if you draw in a dip here, it'll actually have a lower pitch shift, and if you crank it up, it'll have a higher pitch shift. So really cool things. Then I've EQ'd it again to take out some of the highs and some of those pesky 200 hertz areas. And since I've changed the sound so much, the way this EQ responds is totally different. Same with the Saturn, and This EQ not really doing much, just lowering some of the lows, and yeah, that's pretty much it for that sound. Sub bass is really easy. I copied the sound. So I took that sound and I just copied it, and I've replaced the, well, first I've turned off everything except for the first oscillator, and then I've replaced the spectral wavetable with just a sine wave, and took off the bend, and I've just low passed it pretty harshly, and a little sausage fattener to fatten it up. Just about 3%, that's about it. Barely noticeable, just fattens it up a bit.